Now, in the ongoing conversation of different tabletop games to try, one of the ones that struck my fancy a couple of years back when it was going through its Kickstarter, I think it's been a couple of years now, was Auroboros, which is Coils of the Serpent, which is developed by Chris Metzen. Now, anybody who's been around my channel for any length of time knows that I'm also a big MMORPG player, or I have been over the years. 2023 is the first year where I haven't really been playing any MMOs because there's just way too many great single player games to play and great tabletop games to explore. But I have been a World of Warcraft player in the past. It's never been my primary game, but that's where many people know Chris Metzen from because he was one of the major players in terms of crafting the World of Warcraft lore, as well as Warcraft lore prior to World of Warcraft through the first three games. Now, they just sat down and did an interview with him over at Wowhead recently. It's a great interview to sit down and read through. We're going to go through it today, but one of the things that immediately made me chuckle is right off the bat in the second paragraph, they talk about his project, Ouroboros Coils of the Circuit, and they call it a Dungeons and Dragons 5e campaign setting inspired by his first adventurer group. Now, worth noting is that it's actually not a Dungeons and Dragons adventure because Dungeons and Dragons adventures are within the licensed intellectual property or the owned intellectual property by Wizards of the Coast. And this comes back to the mistaken belief by people outside of the tabletop industry who don't know a lot about tabletop, where they just assume that everything TTRPG is Dungeons and Dragons. Now, it is true that this is a 5th edition setting, but it was always marketed as a 5th edition supplement. It's a 5th edition rule set using the 5th edition, but it's his own world, their own intellectual property. If you haven't checked it out, you should. It's really cool. It's basically, and I think they describe it here in a little bit in the interview, which we'll walk through. But it was basically like his campaign from high school, where it was a lot about like rock and roll, heavy metal, and blending that in like a lot of bard stuff into a fantasy setting. So it's kind of cool. We're gonna go through the interview now and dive into this. If this is your first time here, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon. All those things down there are ways you can support. There is a Discord channel as well. We'll talk more about all that at the end. But in the meantime, let's dive into this. So recently, WoW had sat down with Chris, once Senior VP of President of Story and Franchise Development, and now Creative Advisor for the Warcraft leadership team at Blizzard Entertainment. By the way, that's a recent thing. He went off, I think, in 2016, somewhere around in there, to go do his own thing. I think it even says here. Yeah, he left 2016 to found Warchief Gaming, which was a company focused on creating tabletop role-playing games. Then last year, was it really last? Oh, yeah, last year was the release. Okay. I was thinking the Kickstarter was last year. I was like, that's got to be like 2 years ago. A couple years ago was the Kickstarter, and then last year they released their first game, Ouroboros Coils of the Serpent, which is their 5th edition setting. He also wrote a source book called Worldbook Lawbrand for game masters and players, and then worked with Mickey Nielsen, one of the lead writers at Blizzard, who worked on a bunch of franchises, to create Under the Sun, which is a novel telling the crazy story of his teenage role-playing group set in the Lawbrand universe. I guess the Audible book is available as well, narrated by Chris himself, which is kind of cool. Then December of last year, so a couple months ago, Chris returned to Blizzard Entertainment as a creative advisor. And his work, according to John Haidt, general manager of the Warcraft franchise, is on World of Warcraft for now, but will expand to other franchises in the future. Now, that's all well and good, but this article actually focuses on his tabletop stuff, which is why I wanted to bring it up, because as part of the series that I've got going on of other TTRPGs that you should try, this is definitely one of them because I think it's a really unique setting that has a lot of cool stuff in it. Now, this is actually one of the hand-drawn sketches of his first group of adventures, which I think is just kind of cool the way they've got that kind of heavy metal punk vibe. Um, anyway, the interviewer says in 2016 you left Blizzard and founded your own tabletop gaming studio, Warchief Gaming. You developed your game, which is a campaign setting for 5th edition. The setting doesn't tell a random story. Instead, it's the story of your first campaign that you played with your high school friends. It says here, it's safe to say that most TTRPGs people fondly remember their first adventures, but it's just safe to assume that most of them didn't turn those adventures into a published campaign setting. When and how did the plan to turn Ouroboros and the World of Lawbrand into a campaign setting come to mind? And he says, From starting a company, doing this project, and going through the Kickstarter process, everything has taken quite a lot of turns over the past few years. And in the end, Auroboros is pretty much the campaign that my friends and I built when we were kids from around 87 to 94. We played a total of 3 generations of adventure parties, and the Lawbrand Worldbook essentially describes the second generation and the middle story of the world. During that time, we were 17 and 18, just being kids in late high school, reading big, heavy books, listening to rock and roll, and things like that. And over the years, they built out their world, played through it in a coherent storyline, and one day that adventure came to the end. It says our second book, Under the Sun, is a novelization of that adventure, and the ending was pretty emotional. I guess he talks here about one group member stood up, stomped around, was about to leave the room. When that happened in real life, things got really emotional. He said, these moments when real life friendships play out in the fiction you've created are the memories we've all played over the years. Ever since then, I've chased the fusion of role playing, world building, and storytelling. When I left Blizzard about 7 years ago, I wasn't really interested in being creative. I was very ready not to do any of that. Burnout, basically. He says, when I was ready to be creative again, it was not even a question of what I wanted to do. I had been carrying these memories around for years, so why not make it into something to share with the world there? So this is after spending 20 years as a game artist and developer at Blizzard. He basically just got burnout and said, you know what, I'm going to go take some time off. He took some time off, several years, and then he came back with something that went back to his roots. And I think a lot of people can speak to this because if you look at any person who stays in a creative space for, I would argue, 10 years, once you've reached 10 years, you're going to start to feel like you've maybe it's becoming work. Like it's always going to be fun. Pursuing your passion never really feels like work until you're about 10 years in. That's been my experience. I've done multiple projects. I'm 40 years old. I can say that with some authority because by about year 8 to 10 in any given thing that I've ever worked at, you start to feel that sort of okay, I'm struggling. It's not that you're struggling per se, but you are constantly looking for the next inspiration. It doesn't come as easily as it did the first few years because now it's become this thing where you're doing it for a living, and anytime you do something for a living, you're starting to log a lot more hours than you did when it was just a hobby. And the very nature of repeating that process over and over and over again does make it feel somewhat heavy. So I can totally get where he was coming from with doing 20 years being creative and then just taking several years off and not wanting to do anything creative. And then coming back to it and going, you know what, I don't want to do game design for video games. I want to go take this tabletop world that I built with my friends 20, 30 years ago and build this into something really, really cool and do an actual campaign. They then ask him about, what did you take away from your years developing video games? And there are any things you did when designing your TTRPG campaign that would have been impossible to implement in the digital world. And he says here that designing a campaign setting for TTRPG is remarkably similar to what he did at Blizzard, which was writing ideas, framing worlds, creating logical moments between those things in history. He says if you're a world builder or an idea guy, you're absolutely bound to the system, the core of game design, the fantasy experience that you want people to feel, whether it's an RTS, an MMO, or an ARPG, whatever it is. You start with a fantasy. You then try to build a structure that enables the player to feel their accomplishments, to feel the fantasy through the gameplay. It says one of Blizzard's core principles was gameplay first. It says I wasn't always overly fond of that particular value, but at the end of the day, it's true, right? If the thing isn't fun in the first 2 minutes, it doesn't matter how great your story was. There are some ideas that just aren't going to work within a video game system. So when designing Auroboros in terms of ideas, he said it was kind of just me. I had a small team that I would discuss things with and some designer to partner with to provide perspective and keep it on the rails in terms of application to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But other than that, there was no team down the hall, no one who said no, no one to wrestle with. I think that's the main difference, the sense of freedom, unbounded by systems and unshackled by the corporate entity that Blizzard had become over the course of evolution, where he was constantly working within a framework of needing to report all these things to different people and having things go through a committee. Whereas with Ouroboros, it was just him being able to go back to his high school days and just take all those memories and put them down into paper. It's very similar to all the stuff I've done over the years as an author. Because when you're an author on something, most of the time you're working in a bubble. You may have an outline from someone, when you're freelancing, I guess it's a little different because when you're freelancing, you are going to work with someone who's going to have the final say on things. But when you're doing it for yourself, it's your baby and you do work in a bubble and you don't have to report to anybody but yourself. It's liberating. He says, talking about systems, the sigil system in Ouroboros is a great example of combining gameplay design and character lore. So in the world of Lawbrand, characters can use these things called sigils, which are basically ancient tattoos, which give them these extra powers. So he says back when they were 17 or 18, everything was about self-expression. He says I would draw our characters as torn up hippies or as metalheads covered in tattoos. He says, as edgy as it may sound, to us, playing in this world felt like a heavy metal band tour. The rock and roll feel was always core to how we were playing the game, and in Ouroboros, you can tell how epic and arcane someone is by looking at their tattoos. So this is sort of they have the 5th edition rules, and they're using all of that as the base, but the thing that makes their world unique is obviously the setting and the sigil system, which adds an additional layer of flavor on top of the spells that you would traditionally use. So the theme of sacrificing a part of your body to gain arcane powers really resonated with the world we were playing at the time, and also resonated with our young selves. This was kind of cool. Says the most powerful sigil in the game is called the Mark of the Serpent, which allows users to channel the powers of Ouroboros itself. Says, don't you think the system built around different spell tiers, the Coils of the Serpent, provides a bit too much Deus Machina power to handle for the average adventure group? He says, by the way, this is an artist's depiction of a Lawbrand adventure with the Mark of the Serpent. Says a lot of my designer friends said that the system should be more structured, but I think it instigates the relational dynamic in your adventuring group. Getting into the Mark of the Serpent is a burden, not only for that one adventurer who chooses to wear it, because using its powers can most certainly will create crazy situations you never could have planned, and those are adventures we laugh about 10 or 20 years later. That's the magic. You just can't conjure these things, but the whole Serpent engine tries to enable players to emotionally engage with each other. In fact, we would love to hear feedback from people. Was it terrifying, amazing, or challenging? What moments did it create? Says on page 13, your world book starts examining the role of music in Lawbrand. So this is the other aspect of his world that's very unique, which is the correlation of music. It says music is something that fits into the world of Ouroboros, and that was because we were all big fans of music. And the section of the book about the world's most famous bards was written by my friend Daniel, who was part of our group back in the day. And everything about it takes you straight into the feeling of the setting we're trying to create. In fact, we're currently working on our first campaign book called Anthem. So they've got a module coming out, which is really cool. So what they came out with first was just a source book. Now they're coming out with the campaign book, working on the campaign book. Really awesome. It says this is a lighthearted, low-level campaign where your party gets sent to each of the major rock festivals throughout the season, and it's a bedlam. There's the equivalent of a big record label, and they're the bad guys. So your party basically has to save music and freedom of expression. We're also working on a new bard subclass called the Shock Bard. He said, I'm also working on a graphic novel that plays in the Ouroboros universe called The Muse, and it's essentially about a bard who lost inspiration. She's depressed, can't write anymore, but one day someone says, well, I can give you this tattoo that's going to expand your mind. And that's where she starts to flow down the coils of the serpent, slowly losing her mind while composing insane music. I always love stories about music, and thanks to the Lawbrand sourcebook, we can offer people who normally don't play TTRPGs another way to enjoy the world of Ouroboros. 5 new playable species in Lawbrand. There's the desert dwarves, and this is more about what separates them from D&D dwarves, or World of Warcraft dwarves, so I'm going to skip that part. By the way, the world map cartographer lady that they worked on with this was Francesca Berald. If you've never seen her work, she's an Italian artist. I thought about commissioning her at one point when I was working on the Saga Blucimi, but she was way out of our budget at the time. But her art is amazing, and they got her to do the world map for Lawbrand. And they were based on his original squiggle maps, which I'm intimately familiar with pencil maps. It's great. Um, it's really cool stuff. Then they ask him about, is there any chance we could see Ouroboros turn into a video game? And he pretty much says, no. Not. He says he wouldn't do it. He says here that he'd be open to someone else doing it, but he doesn't want to do it anymore. Like he's spent 20 years doing video game development and doesn't really want to do any of that. He says, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give a group of adventurers who decide to enter the Lawbrand universe? And he says, I'd say the most important thing that occurs is kind of more aimed at game masters. There's a section of the source book with guides for each city and faction that contain a number of randomized tables containing adventure prompts, or things you might hear randomly. He says, I know most game masters want their group to play in these big and epic storylines, but how about you'd pull back on those and let your group breathe? Roll some die on those tables and let the players drive. You can always keep your themes in mind, but letting the players do goofy stuff is what gets you in deep and fast, and that's particularly true in our world of Ouroboros. Yeah, I mean, so I do something if you've ever watched any of my live streams when I'm DMing, I use flavor dice, which is just a D6. It's the way that I use them where if I ever just want to add a level of randomness to something, I roll the flavor dice, or I have the players roll the flavor dice, and the dice dictate what we do. A certain number is good for the player, a certain number is bad for the player. Conversely, a certain number is good for the NPC, and a certain number is bad for the NPC. And depending on what the dice say, we then that becomes the role play scenario. So it forces spontaneity into things if you ever get stuck in something, or you're in a situation where you're going off the rails and you don't necessarily want to follow the structure. So essentially, it's just another DM tip, which I think is cool. Anyway, um, for those of you who want to check out another fantasy world, I think the World of Auroboros is one you should check out. It released last year after a successful Kickstarter. It's got a lot of weird elements to it, but it is great fantasy fun for those of you who want to get into something that has a lot of references to heavy metal and music and tattoos and that kind of stuff. This is out there. It's available. Dive into it. If you have played this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Drop them down in the comments below. If you have random thoughts or comments or questions, drop them down there as well. Don't forget, if you want to support, it's really easy. First and foremost, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon so you never miss an update as we continue to do all of our tabletop series. Don't forget, every Sunday we do the This Week in Tabletop RPGs at 8 a.m. Central Time here on the channel. You can subscribe as a member to support the channel. You can also do super thanks, super chat, super stickers. There's a Patreon page where you can get a copy of our source book as well as our point and click adventure game and the first module for our world. And there's a book series. It's helpful to see over there as well. There's the Discord down there, links in the description. See everybody next week. Have fun.